Welcome back to It's Not Normal, the podcast, episode 35. This week's episode is a Q&A episode. This is our first ever Q&A podcast episode. So many of you submitted questions that were really great and thought-provoking. I just want to jump right into it, I think. And I guess the only thing before I get started is, a thank you to everyone who reached out. I really appreciate the time and thought that you put into these questions. So thank you very much. And let's get into it. The first question: what are some things to work on once you go no contact and you live on your own? Anything and everything that comes your way. I think it's common when you're raised by an emotionally immature or a narcissistic parent to view life through your parents' lens or through a lens that they have created for you. And I think when you are finally out of that environment, you start to view life as yourself and for yourself. And so I think there are going to be a lot of experiences and emotions and relationships that come your way that you'll have a completely different perspective on, that will start to inform a little bit more about who you are and who you were, how past behaviors might have impacted you or influenced your own behavior. I think it's a really significant period of learning. For me, probably the most transformative step in this healing process has been learning to acknowledge my emotions. I think that for me is the root of communication, good, healthy communication, learning to set and maintain boundaries, and learning to validate my emotions and my experience. I think all of those things start with learning how to acknowledge your emotions. And I think when you're raised in that kind of environment, I think there's a tendency for conversations and interactions and emotions to be very reactive and volatile and explosive. I think it can be common to inherit that feeling that these things are happening to you, that they are innately who you are. It's much harder to separate yourself from your emotions because you were never taught to do that. And so I think for me, probably the most beneficial step in learning to regulate my own emotions has been learning to acknowledge them. And then I think you can start to take it one step further, and you can start to ask yourself, okay, well, why am I feeling this? Why did this experience, why did this conversation bring this to the surface for me? Where does this come from? And so then you start to answer the question, not only how am I feeling and what am I feeling, but why am I feeling this? And I think understanding the history, I guess the root of that reaction or that emotion allows you, or at least it has allowed me to validate those emotions within myself. When you're raised by emotionally immature parents, I think they expect you to repress all of your emotions, your true feelings, especially if they're negative. And I think that is why learning to acknowledge your emotions can be such a significant and challenging step, especially to start to do those things in adulthood. All right, the next question. Want to send my parents a letter to get some final things off my chest, but I'm afraid they'll be angry. I'm afraid of another aggressive smear campaign, but the letter would help me kind of let go. I have written a handful of letters to my parents, only 2 of which I have sent over the course of the last 5 years. And the first was not long after I moved out in the hopes of patching things up. And the most recent was not long after I got married. The first letter that I sent to my parents was much more emotional. I think at that point, I hadn't yet come to the realization that I alone was not capable of changing my parents' behavior. And so I think when I sent that first letter, I was still in that headspace that if I was able to sit down and write out exactly how I was feeling with really clear examples, and I was able to fully express myself in a really clear, concise way and hand this to them, there is no way that they won't see reason in this. That was my thought process going into it, that I can explain myself, they'll see reason, and we can move forward in a healthy way together. And the difference, I think, between that and my most recent letter was largely fueled by the realization that I had that I cannot change my parents. And just because they carry with them the titles of mom and dad doesn't necessarily mean that our relationship takes precedence or is stronger than whatever they're dealing with on a personal level. And so if they're not willing or ready to acknowledge these unhealthy behaviors or these toxic patterns, if they consistently deny their role in them, nothing that I write is going to change that. And so this most recent letter that I sent was more an objective recall of behavior and using those things to outline and explain my boundaries moving forward. And so I would say, if you're feeling compelled to write a letter to your parents, do it. Absolutely do it. But when it comes to actually sending it, let it sit for a week or 2 weeks. It's important to recognize if you're looking for some kind of a reaction or a response even from your parent or parents as a result of a letter that you write, you may not get that. That no matter what you say, it may not change your current situation. It may not make them see things the way that you hope for them to see them. And I think for me, that was really important in the past, weighing whether or not it was worth reaching out. I also think it's important to remember that unlike a phone call or an in-person conversation, a letter can feel much more permanent. I think when you hand someone a physical copy that details your emotions, which, emotions are ever changing. And while I definitely think that there are certain feelings that are very strong and true that you will hold for a very long time, it's impossible to predict what life might throw our way. And so how you're feeling might change. And if you've given someone, especially someone who might be more inclined to deliberately misinterpret what you're saying, it can almost minimize the potential for change and growth for you in the eyes of a parent. I think when you're dealing with emotionally immature parents in general, the idea of change can be difficult to digest. But now, if you've got this physical copy of how you're feeling in the moment, I think regardless of what might change in your life after you send that letter, they still might hold you to that version of yourself. And so my best piece of advice, aside from writing the letter and letting it sit for a week or two before you actually make the decision to send it, is to try your best to be observational rather than emotional. I think if you are sending this letter with the intent of informing your parents of your boundaries, of sort of your terms moving forward for the relationship, I think that might yield much better results for you and your relationship than if you were to write out a letter detailing your emotions and how their unhealthy behavior made you feel. It's very common for emotionally immature parents and people in general to become very defensive whenever they feel like they're being spoken about negatively. And, you have to remember that they are going to be reading that letter through their own lens. There's a high likelihood that it can skew what the actual intention of your letter is. Expectations can really get in the way, and I think drive you to want to do something like this in the hope that they will respond in a positive way, and that either that will result in them changing their behavior or in you feeling better. I think a big part of healing is recognizing that you don't need the forgiveness or the apology from someone who is not capable or willing of giving that to you to actually move on. All right, next question. Is it normal to feel guilty for leaving your parents? In short, yes. I did an entire podcast episode on guilt, just talking about things that I currently experience guilt for doing or saying or thinking or feeling, and also tracing that back to experiences throughout my childhood. And I think when we're specifically talking about leaving our parents and distancing ourselves from our immediate family, of course there is guilt involved. And I think a lot of it has to do with these preconceived notions that so many of us grow up around. We grow up hearing them. I think they're reinforced by a lot of prominent figures in our lives throughout childhood, which are your parents love you and your parents care about you the most. And everything that they do for you, they're doing it because they love you and they just want the best for you. And so I think when you couple that with this inherent sort of family loyalty that I think is really common to feel in relationships in general, but I think especially with your immediate family, there is a very heavy sense of guilt that you can feel for removing yourself from that dynamic voluntarily. No matter the behavior, the words, the actions that caused you to distance yourself, no matter how hurtful or harmful they were, I think it's still normal to feel guilty. It can be an even more difficult thing when you don't have a support system. I think a lot of times when you're facing something new, let's say maybe you go through a really rough breakup, whether that's a friend breakup or a breakup with a romantic partner, if you have that solid foundation of your family, you can kind of retreat back to them and get that reassurance and that support that can help you to understand why you removing yourself from that relationship was a positive thing to do, and to reassure you that everything is going to be okay moving forward. But I think when the people that you're breaking out of relationships with are your parents, it sometimes doesn't leave you with a very firm, supportive foundation. And so I think it can be difficult to move forward feeling confident in yourself and your decisions when you have to search a little bit harder for that reassurance, even if that comes within yourself. But yes, I think in short, it is normal to feel guilty anytime you break away from your family dynamic. Anytime you even sometimes just view your parents objectively. And, viewing your parents and their behavior objectively is not a form of betrayal. And yet it can feel like that. And I think you can be made to feel like that by your parents when you start to view them objectively. Because I think they begin to fear this facade, this image that they've worked so hard and long to maintain, being dismantled in front of them. And I think more than anything, that is a fear of a narcissistic parent or an emotionally immature parent, is being revealed to be shown as what or who they truly are. And to combat that, I think they'll do anything. I think this is, when we start to get into these different manipulative tactics that parents like this might use to regain control over you. And really, I think what they're trying to regain is your obedience, is your compliance in their behavior. And they might do everything from a really harsh smear campaign, whether that's personal or public, to love bombing and portraying themselves as this helpless, innocent victim. And, I haven't been sleeping for days and I'm sick to my stomach. I can't even get up and go to work because I'm so heartbroken. I think they will try anything and everything under the sun to try to make you feel guilty and to try to get you to doubt your decision, to doubt yourself, and ultimately to go back. And so, of course, I think guilt is a normal emotion. I would definitely recommend going to check out that full episode on guilt for a bit more detail on this. It is episode 17 of It's Not Normal. All right, next question. And I have to say, this was probably my favorite question that I received, because I think it covers a lot of different aspects of healing. And I think it's also very central to being raised by emotionally immature parents and where that leaves you in adulthood. And so the question is, what do I do if I'm still struggling to know my identity that has been stripped by my narcissistic parent? So many of us who were raised by emotionally immature parents, who developed hypervigilance, who were parentified and felt this incredible responsibility to shoulder our family's emotions experience this confusion when it comes to our identity. Parents in that kind of environment will condition you to believe that self-neglect is a noble behavior. Like it's your responsibility to put everyone else first and to experience life through them or through a lens that they are comfortable with. And so they sort of make you feel like you experiencing life for and as yourself primarily is somehow wrong or selfish. And so the idea of getting to know yourself, which I think we can only really do by experiencing things and turning a lot of our time and energy inward, asking ourselves really important questions. How am I feeling? Do I like this? Do I not like this? What do I want to do? I think that is when we're able to start to fill in these gaps. Whether it's a positive, negative, or a learning experience, it will tell you something about yourself if you allow yourself to be at the center of that experience. For so long, I think throughout childhood, for a lot of us, we put ourselves in the back seat voluntarily because we felt like the more emotionally mature person in our parent-child dynamic in that relationship. And so we were consistently, maybe even unconsciously, suppressing a lot of emotions and not giving ourselves time or space for personal growth and evolution. And I think a lot of those things help to develop your identity and your sense of self. I think existing in that kind of environment for so long that is so chaotic, it's so draining and demanding, and it requires consistent attention. And the result, I think, whenever you take a step back or you turn that off or you shift the focus to yourself, there's always the possibility of things unraveling. Narcissistic and emotionally immature parents alike tend to claim ownership over things that are not theirs. That can be everything from your opinions and your time and energy to sentiment and things that have meaning to you or things that you're interested in. Just because your parents are your parents doesn't mean that they can dictate what does and doesn't have meaning to you, what you do and don't like, what you're interested in and what you're not interested in. You are your own person, and that's okay. I have found that some of the things that have helped me to fill in the gaps about my identity, mainly from these earlier years of my life, have been reclaiming ownership over things that were once tied directly to my parents or to my family. I think it would be foolish to say that none of your identity stems from your childhood or experiences throughout your childhood. I think even if you are raised by emotionally immature parents, there can be certain values that are instilled in you or memories or traditions that inform a part of your identity that can be really disorienting to completely detach from. And I think when you find yourself in a new, healthy, calmer environment, a lot of emotions will start making their way to the surface, sort of flooding out. And for me, I was kind of at a crossroads where I now felt, okay, I know that how I'm feeling is unhealthy, but I don't quite know how to feel yet. And the process of getting to where I am now started with deconstructing a lot of what I once thought I knew. And a big part, I think, of starting fresh and being able to rebuild is allowing yourself to take some things from your past and to reclaim ownership of them, to sort of reframe them so that they can be a part of your life in a healthy way. You can assign new meaning to old memories, to old experiences and traditions, values. That, I think, allows you to take some of the positives and intertwine them with a lot of the healthy behaviors that you're learning now. All right, next question. How do you stop feeling anger/resentment towards an emotionally immature parent? That's a great question too. And I think it's important to acknowledge that you can and do sometimes feel very real anger and deep-seated resentment for an emotionally immature parent. I was just thinking about it earlier today, and I had a lot of things on my mind, small little tasks that I wanted to get done throughout the day. And I think part of that comes with the responsibility of being an adult and taking care of yourself. And this thought popped into my mind, which was, I'm angry that for the chunk of time in my life where I was supposed to be free of responsibilities and worry, and really just all I had to do was learn how to be a person and to figure out the things that I like and don't like in a safe environment where my basic needs like food and shelter were being met, where I didn't have to think about those things. I felt angry that so much of that time in my life was dominated by some very real, heavy responsibilities, stress and tension. I didn't feel like I was fully given that childhood opportunity, I guess. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that those are very real feelings that might come up when you're raised in an environment like that. And, the first step for me, I think, is the idea of mentalization. And that's a concept that is talked about in the book that I'm currently reading. And it basically just describes the ability to understand that everyone perceives and experiences reality in a different way. And when you take a step back and you think about life, there are an infinite number of experiences and relationships, conversations that in one way or another shape who you are. They inform your decisions, your reactions, your emotions. And I think recognizing that that is true for everyone. Every person is kind of experiencing life and viewing what's happening in front of them through their own unique lens that has been created over time through these infinite number of experiences is really beneficial in letting go of some of that anger and resentment. And in this book, which is Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents by Lindsay Gibson, which I've talked about in the past and I will continue to talk about because it is such an incredible resource for anyone who is healing from emotional abuse. In this book, the author talks about how the first step in achieving emotional freedom is assessing our parents' emotional maturity level. And for me, that has been really beneficial in kind of separating my parents' words and actions from myself and my decisions, the way that I choose to live my life. Because I've been able to recognize that in certain ways, I believe them to be emotionally stunted. I think as a result maybe of their own trauma, their own unresolved trauma, they weren't able to fully develop the emotional maturity that maybe other adults have. And I think a lot of that informed their decisions and their behavior that I was exposed to throughout my childhood. And so I think being able to view your parents objectively and to go into that relationship or even an interaction with realistic expectations based on their emotional maturity level can help you to not feel as triggered, to not carry as much anger or resentment, I think, with you. You're able to start to understand that a lot of these more negative behaviors were much more about them than they ever were about you. And so I think being able to take that step back and remove yourself allows you to not feel those things so personally, because there's an incentive or a motive behind it that is completely separate from anything that you said or did. And, I don't think it's uncommon for adults who were raised by emotionally immature parents to hold a lot of compassion for their parents. I know that, I go through cycles. I think healing and grieving a relationship with your parents, especially when they're still alive, is cyclical. I think sometimes you feel that anger and resentment. I think there are other times when you mourn that relationship and you're sitting with grief. And I think there are also times when you hold a lot of compassion for your parents, especially if you are taking the steps to heal this trauma and to heal from this abuse and this manipulation. You are starting to understand at the very least that there is a world outside of this. You're starting to gain some perspective, and you're experiencing the calm and the direct communication, and you start to see how simple and straightforward and fulfilling and healthy things can truly be. And I think once you start to enter into that phase of your life, at least for me, I've thought about how much I wish that my parents would take those steps so that they can experience the world in a healthy way. I saw something recently on the Raised by Narcissists subreddit, and someone was asking, what has helped you to fully detach? And someone in the comments answered with this really well thought out, sort of thoughtfully written response. And I think it directly ties into this question. And they basically described this idea that for so many of us throughout childhood who were raised by an emotionally immature or a narcissistic parent, we're starved of validation. And so it can be really challenging as we move into adulthood to learn and allow ourselves to validate our own emotions, to validate our life experience, and to feel confident in ourselves and our decisions. And so they described this daily practice of reassuring yourself, of allowing yourself to validate your emotions and your decisions. And that can be anything from taking 10 minutes a day to revisit an old conversation with a friend when you were talking about something and they were reassuring you and, kind of bolstering your self-confidence and reminding you that you made the right decision by putting yourself first, or that you're a good person, to doing a little bit of research on narcissistic characteristics and behaviors, the long-term effects of being raised by an emotionally immature parent. If hypervigilance is something that you developed as a result of being raised in an environment like that, do a bit of reading on that to kind of validate these things for yourself, to prove to yourself that they are real things that are a result of real unhealthy behavior that you endured. I think it's really common to experience self-doubt also. I think when you endure gaslighting so consistently throughout your childhood, it can be really easy to carry that with you in your adult life. And especially once you start to realize your trauma and maybe even speak about it, to start to gaslight yourself. I certainly know that I have experienced those emotions where I've questioned, was it really that bad? Did it happen that way? Was this my fault? Was I just born bad? And there are a few moments that really stand out for me that allow me in these moments of self-doubt to reassure myself, to kind of revisit this experience and see it for what it is so clearly that it leaves me feeling without a shadow of a doubt that I am valid in my emotions and I can feel confident and proud of the decisions that I have made in my life. And so I think this idea, this daily practice of reassuring yourself, can be really beneficial in you learning to validate your emotions. And I think that might lead to a bit of freedom from the anger and the resentment that you sometimes feel, because it is normal to feel angry and to resent your emotionally immature parents for things that they have said or done to you that were extremely hurtful and maybe lasting. But I think what comes with validation is the ability to process those emotions as you're feeling them and then let them go. Because the truth of the matter, in my opinion, is that anger is a dead end. I don't think allowing anger to dominate your persona or your experience is going to get you where you want to be. I don't think it lends itself to the results that you're looking for. I think it's more of an emotion that you should allow yourself to feel when it comes to the surface, but then you should also encourage yourself to let it go and to move on. All right, next question. Do you feel your family had generational trauma, and how do you cope with any feelings that come up with that? That is a phenomenal question, and definitely something that I have thought about. It's brought to the surface lots of different emotions for me over the course of the last 5 years especially. One of the first things that I want to address, yes, I do think that generational trauma was at play in my family dynamic. I think most of the time when you're dealing with an emotionally immature or a narcissistic parent, a lot of that behavior is rooted in unresolved childhood trauma. And I don't think these unhealthy behaviors and manipulative tactics are developed or have their roots in a healthy parent-child relationship or family dynamic. And so I think more often than not, when you're faced with a situation like this, generational trauma may be at play. And so, that being said, the first thing that I want to acknowledge in addressing this question is the guilt that can sometimes come to the surface. I have felt at times bad for distancing myself voluntarily from my parents, while understanding that generational trauma was likely a factor in their behavior throughout my childhood. I do think that it's important to note that a narrative that I'm sure a lot of us grew up around was, you have nothing to be upset about because you have it so much better than I did. I think there's sort of this toxic positivity that can be preached sometimes, where you're encouraged to never feel bad about anything because there are so many people out there, maybe your parents included, who had it so much worse than you did. And so I think that's important to note as we address the guilt that can sometimes come to the surface when we're dealing with generational trauma. It's a very complex series of emotions, I think, that you're dealing with when you're faced with this idea that our parents' behavior doesn't fit within our boundaries, even if their behavior is better than that of their parents. And so we've addressed the guilt. And I think another one of the ways that I cope with these feelings is learning to distinguish the good from the bad. I think when you're dealing with generational trauma and abuse, it reaches a point in a generation, in a person, where they are going to stop it. We did a whole episode on cycle breakers and what it means, the burden of being a cycle breaker. And knowing that moving forward, your relationship with yourself and with other people will be much healthier is great. But understanding that that sometimes can come at the cost of your own relationship with your immediate family and previous generations can be really challenging as well. And so for me, something that I try to do is to distinguish the good from the bad. And similar to what we mentioned earlier in this episode, I think it would be foolish not to admit that even when you're raised in that kind of environment, there are values and memories and traditions that were primarily positive. They were a primarily positive experience for you. And when you find yourself thinking of those things, or you discover a similarity that you share with your parent that can be positive in your life, I think it's allowing yourself to perpetuate those things and to let the positive parts of your parents live on as you heal the more negative parts that you might have inherited from them. And in a lot of ways, I think, we've talked about how being raised in that kind of environment, you're conditioned to believe that self-neglect is a noble behavior. But I think one of the noblest behaviors is to heal this generational trauma so that your family, generations moving forward, can have healthy relationships with one another. And hopefully infused in them can be some positive characteristics and qualities of your parents that you allowed to shine through, that you carried on with you. And then I think there's this false sense of power that a lot of us develop and carry with us, this belief that we can solve our parents' and our family's problems. I think it's important to remember that if our parents cannot or are choosing not to acknowledge their problems, that sense of power is very much a false sense of power. There is nothing that we can do to solve their problems for them. As you move into adulthood, you develop the ability to physically or emotionally distance yourself from that relationship so that you can grow and heal in a way that is substantial. The degree to which you distance yourself from your parents or from your family as you take this on is dependent upon your relationship with your parents, what your goals are for the relationship, and mainly how much you're able to grow and evolve and maintain your boundaries while also maintaining a relationship with them. The only person that we can change, in truth, is ourselves. And if we want to end generational trauma, if we do not want to perpetuate the more negative behaviors that we might have picked up on from our parents, or the reactions, the impulses, the trauma responses that we developed as a result of being raised in that kind of environment, the only thing that we can truly do is to heal those things within ourselves. And that will then show through in our relationship with ourselves and with the people around us. There's this idea, I think, of family loyalty and loyalty within relationships in general that, again, I think is very real. But when we're dealing with a topic as complex as this, I think it's important to remember that it's okay to feel loyal to yourself first, because in that way, you, as a member of that family, can continue to grow a branch of that family that will have healthy communication, that will have an open and honest dialogue, that will treat other people with kindness and respect and empathy. And I think that is a driving force for me, understanding that I cannot change the past and I cannot change other people, but I can change myself and in turn, the future of myself and my family. So with that, I think I'll be wrapping up this week's episode. Thank you so much to everyone who took the time to send in a question or to share a story. I wasn't able to get through all of them today, but I don't doubt that I'll be doing this again. And I'm always thinking of more ways for us to connect more directly so that I can answer the questions that are a bit more specific to you and offer up my own perspective. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. If you're listening on Spotify, please leave us a rating. I will be back next week with another episode of It's Not Normal, the podcast. Bye.